Iran, Before and After the Revolution. Author Wadim Procel. The factors that led to the outbreak of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978 to 1979, and then led to the seizure of power by Ayatollah Khomeini, should be analyzed from the economic and political perspective. Moreover, the relationship of the governing authorities with the society strongly influenced the collapse of the Mohammad Reza Pahlavi dynasty regime. The economic situation in Iran was crucial for the events in 1979. The country was in very poor condition. As the result of the economic and political crisis, the situation developed like the eruption of a volcano. Although the dynamic economic growth was still high in Iran, problems began to appear in agriculture as the number of employed in the sector decreased year by year. Poor situation in the agricultural production overlapped with the population growth from 18 to 34 million people in the years 1956 to 1976. The declining economic situation in agriculture was caused by land speculation practices. What is more, real estate deals in favor of the governing party and the unprofitability of production caused mass migration of the agricultural population in the cities. In addition, the authorities had to face so-called the Alliance of the Bazaar, a powerful non-governmental organization created by people from the local farms, small and medium entrepreneurs, and local Muslim leaders. This naturally created group was a real opposition that no government could break down and eliminate from influencing the affairs of the country. The beginning of the end of the imperial regime is connected with the new policy of Prime Minister Jamshid Muzigar. Initially, his policy was aimed at improving administration, the fight against corruption, inflation, and the export of national capital abroad. However, his policy contributed to the crisis of the Iranian economy because state investments were overdeveloped. Different departments and provinces lost some of their governmental donations and financial backup. Private loans were withheld. This policy led to the bankruptcy of hundreds of construction companies. In the same time, the customs taxes increased. In contrary, the state-owned companies were promoted. For example, the import duties on steel products were lowered. The new prime minister aimed to protect the state-owned companies where the royal families had shares. Therefore, the taxes were risen and the excessive bureaucracy of administration was introduced. The government policy of raising the commercial tariffs caused the plight of farmers and business people who were not able to face the market competition. Prime Minister Muzigar's policies resulted in the ongoing embezzlement, corruption, protection of his own and the royal family interests. There were also political factors which had a strong influence on the situation in Iran. During the Pahlavi dynasty reign, the authorities began to interfere on the internal affairs of society through the governmental secret service. Moreover, the creator of the dynasty, a former Cossack regiment officer, led brutal repressions against the mullahs, arrested and jailed many people who did not want to support the government. The situation was worsened by parceling the land of religious communities by the governmental offices and then passing it over to the Pahlavi Foundation, whereas the testament of every Muslim was to give the land to the mosques. Indignation of the Iranians was also caused by the reform of the calendar, which, in contrary to the Islamic tradition, requiring counting according to Hijrah, that is, Muhammad's escape to Medina in 622, was changed and the year 0 was placed in 559 BC, when Cyrus the Great ascended to the throne. The idea of Persian state was something completely hostile to many Iranians, and the coronation of the Shah in Persepolis caused a deep resentment to the Shah among the Iranian society. Self-proclaimed Pahlavi dynasty was not accepted by the society because of their national policy and the way people were treated. This political and social situation opened the door for Ayatollah Khomeini, who wanted religious and political freedom for the Iranian society. He proclaimed the idea of the Islamic Republic, supported by Shiites who did not take part in the Pahlavi government, and the Shia mullahs were pure and trustworthy in the eyes of the masses. There was a sharp censorship in Pahlavi's Iran. There were no trade unions, and the parliament was fiction. Legal associations were broken by the security apparatus, subordinated to the royal family. The secret police, Savak, was created. It was the most important police-type institution which watched over the internal security of the empire. Its purpose was to gather necessary information to maintain internal security, detect espionage, and, above all, to observe and smash the internal opposition that worked to overthrow the Pahlavi government. The head of Savak, Ni'matullah Nasiri, controlled all the institutions of the state, influenced the economy, political life, and above all, controlled the lives of ordinary Iranian citizens. Savak was closely assisted by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, which controlled the Iranian opposition residing in exile in the United States. Also, the Israeli intelligence, Mossad, fearing Arab nationalism, supported the Iranian intelligence. Another symbol of support for the imperial power was the army created by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. His army was equipped with the most modern weapons. This Shah's army, along with Savak, was a tool of internal repression and control over ordinary Iranian citizens. It was effective thanks to the cooperation of the imperial regime with the United States. CIA agents trained military instructors in Iran and supplied arms to the Iranian army. The ideal of the imperial family began to falter in 1978. Then, on January 7, 1978, an article accusing Ayatollah Khomeini of homosexuality and cooperation with the English intelligence was published. The next day, it triggered strong protest in the Shiite religious and cultural center in Iran in the city of Qom. The schools were closed and the first riots in which 10 people died. Echoes of the Qom salons alarm all centers of worship. The Shiites began to preach the slogan of the Islamic Republic. Further fears erupted in the powerful industrial center in Tabriz, where, on February 18, 1978, about 50,000 people came out on the streets. Also at that time, force was used, hoping to stop further protests, which was only achieved for 40 days. In April and May 1978, there were new protests in Tehran, Tabriz, Qom, Kerman, and Susa. The army, on orders from the empire, surrounded the bazaar, where a large gathering of Muslim clans continued. On the 9th of May in Qom and Mashedsi, students who fight against the army come out on the streets. On May 15th, all of Tehran was involved in riots, but the Shah still refused to accept talks with the revolutionaries. But in June, in the face of protests and fights, the Shah goes on the first concessions. On June 6th, the head of Savak, General Nasir, is dismissed. On June 21st, it was announced that membership in the ruling party, Raz Takizi, is not mandatory. However, these concessions do not stop the fighting. On July 22nd, there are violent clashes in Mitsesta, in which about 250 demonstrators die. The climax moment of the Islamic Revolution was August, when it was Ayatollah Khomeini who was officially calling to speak against the Shah and overthrow the Pahlavi regime. The response was immediate. The mosques became agitation points and revolutionary cells. On August 27th, the Shashif dismisses the government of Amuzagar and appoints Sharif Amani, who restores the Muslim calendar, but rumors of his cooperation with the British, regarded as natural enemies, causes society's reluctance towards him. In November, the Iranian general was against the prime minister, the British embassy was attacked, which means that the Shah, fearing losing support, not only to the army, but also to world powers, announces political freedom and orders Imami to start unofficial talks with Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini, with the support of over 90% of society, refuses to make any concessions and demands categorically resignation of the Shah, who is making further reconstruction in the government, trying to convince the public to stop fighting. Meanwhile, during the feast of Eid el-Fitr, at the foot of Elbrus, about 1 million believers gathered, demanding the resignation of the Pahlavi dynasty. On the same evening, the Shah appoints the military governor of Tehran, General Ghulam Ovisi, a supporter of the imperial family, which on September 8th, in the so-called Black Friday, carries out a massacre of 180 demonstrators in Tehran, as well as in other cities. There is a sharp suppression of demonstrations against chess. For a time, the situation is controlled by the Shah. The government of Imami tries to seize the advantage and start repressive actions against the opposition. But when the loud trail of students comes on October 9th, fighting with the army again takes place all over the country. For the Shah, however, the most important thing is that for the first time since the outbreak of the riots, workers from industrial plants and refineries, in which the imperial family was involved, began to strike. In Gorgan, Qom, Tehran, student riots are continually erupting, and the military intelligence tries to reach Khomeini by trying to persuade him to cooperate. But the lack of reaction from the Ayatollah has fueled the Iranian people to fight. November 4th, 1978, Gholam Azari becomes the new prime minister. For the first time, Shah advocates revolution and change. But the situation is getting worse by the day. November 22nd, tanks are sent to the streets. Mukarram is sold during the morning feast. Strikes are spreading. Fighting against government forces are intensifying. On December 10th and 11th, there are bloody incidents in military barracks where soldiers commit murders on officers, and more frequent cases of desertion occur. The Iranian Revolution also echoes overseas. And in the United States, a special group with David Newsom was created to assess the situation in Iran and possible help for the Shah. The Americans, however, were afraid of introducing official help. The American intelligence knew perfectly well that Libya and the Palestine Liberation Organization were throwing weapons to Iran intended for revolutionaries. The only chance for maintaining the imperial power was a military coup that would suppress the uprising and restore the real power to the Shah. However, on January 3, 1979, the Shah appointed Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, who announces the dissolution of Savak, the release of political prisoners, and agrees to return to the homeland of Khomeini, who rejects all proposals. In January 1979, American General Robert Heiser arrives to Iran to persuade the Iranian general to move to the revolution. But when, on 13 January, Ayatollah Khomeini announces the rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Council, the situation suddenly changes. The United States ceases to support the Pahlavi regime because to keep influences in the extraction of Iran oil could not support the Shah, which was in a lost position. Shah Mohammad Pahlavi, losing the support of society, army, and world powers, decides to leave Iran on January 16, 1979, going to Aswan, Egypt. This arouses enthusiasm in all of Iran, but power still belongs to the people associated with the appraisal. The situation changes again on January 22nd, when Sahed Teherani, chairman of the Regency Council, announces his resignation to Khomeini, which, for the first time, recognizes Khomeini as a legitimate partner for talks. January 25th, Khomeini announces his return to Iran, but it does not calm the situation because, until February 1st that is, return of Khomeini to his homeland comes to constant battles on the streets. After the return of Ayatollah Khomeini, the provisional government is immediately formed, with the leader of the Iranian liberation movement, Mehdi Bazargan, which means that the Bacteria imperial government agrees to a referendum to indicate whether the population is a monarchy or an Islamic republic. Khomeini's return does not please everyone. There are internal struggles in the Iranian army. So-called immortals, elite imperial troops, began breaking up those military groups that supported Khomeini. This means that the side of the rebellious troops is in favor of the public, which is the reason for the bankruptcy of Batiara, who was leaving for France, fearing for his life. On February 12th, the High Council of the Armed Forces decides to hang the weapon. The army that refuses to make a further blood transfer decides not only to stop further fighting with the revolutionaries, but in the climactic movement it decides to join the Islamic Revolution, thus becoming the ultimate factor of collapse the Pahlavi regime. The situation in Iran after Khomeini seizes power and the provisional government headed by Mehdi Bazargan restores order in Iran. Students return to colleges. Striking industrial plants and refineries return to work. But the new government runs its own policy. People associated with the imperial regime are immediately arrested and imprisoned in order to get rid of the apparatus of power related to the appraisal. On February 13th, Mehdi Bazargan appoints a new government, and Khomeini, at the head of the state, organizes the authorities in the country. Thanks to his contacts, the visit of Yasser Arafat to the world powers is a signal that Iran's foreign policy has changed. Khomeini's ultimate record of power is the April referendum of the monarchy or republic, in which about 97% of people are in favor of the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The takeover of power by Khomeini and his supporters caused serious international repercussions. The United States suffered a defeat in the Middle East in connection with the fall of the Pahlavi regime. On March 13, 1979, Iran followed by Pakistan from the Cento-military anti-charge war. Khomeini establishes contacts with Gaddafi. Their goal is to create a third force after the United States and the Soviet Union that could oppose capitalism and socialism. The situation in the Middle East changed day by day. The rise of a powerful Islamic State, it became a threat not only to Israel, who was afraid that Iran could stand up for Palestine, but also for Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and many smaller countries or emirates in the Middle East. This threat was real because in the years 1980 to 1988, Iran was waging war with Iraq for access to ports in the Persian Gulf. This war had not only political, but also religious grounds. It strengthened Islamic influence in this region, whose followers undertook a holy war for regaining influence on lost territories in the 19th century. The war with Iraq also changed the position of Iran, which, fighting with Iraq, also had against the United States, which assisted Saddam Hussein. Since the turn of the 1970s and 1980s, Iran has become a threat to the United States, Israel, but also to its neighbors, which is also visible today because its political aspirations extended throughout the Middle East, which causes a real threat of war in the region.